Hello, everyone. Welcome to VRIC Media, your most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm your host, Darrell Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of meeting with the green chicken himself, Doomberg. How's it going?
Darrell, the hat looks great on you, I must say. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. I was wondering, we had a show a long time ago, and you mentioned that you were into collecting Rolexes. So I was wondering how the green chicken is flexing nowadays.
Well, the tariff situation is certainly helping. It's causing a little bit of excitement in the secondary market as buyers try to front run whatever's coming out of the White House these days, which I can tell you, working on a 4-day editorial cycle is incredibly challenging to do. Trump is a man of many opinions, sometimes in great conflict with each other, and often rolled out in rapid fire. But no, Rolex is just part of our saving strategy, of course, and I prefer to save in things that tend to hold their value and that I have some knowledge about. And so gold and a few Rolex watches and a bit of land here and there makes up a good portfolio.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I saw an article about a Swiss watchmaker trying to front run tariffs and such. And so I can imagine that it may be going to hit that foreign market at some point.
Yeah, although that should, to be clear, that's not the type of thing that you bank on when you allocate part of your worth to a saving strategy like that. But to the extent that it puts a bid under my collection, I'm glad to see it, although I don't intend to sell into it. So it's just nice to see every once in a while.
Yeah. So I do want to cover tariffs. There's been kind of just some interesting news. I mean, some of the audience, they weren't too favorable of my views on tariffs. I view it as a tax. But I understand, where other people stand on the other side of the spectrum or whatnot. So recently, NVIDIA and AMD decided to give the U.S. government 15% of their sales to China, of chips to China. And I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? Like, is this something that has happened in our history, or like, what is this a representation of?
Not much about Trump has any precedent in history, if we're being totally honest. I go back to a great piece on thematic markets. My friend Marvin Barth wrote a piece early on in the Trump administration comparing this administration to the mafia, I think La Casa Nostra. And in a way, this is just, if you're familiar with The Godfather and the opening scenes of The Godfather Part 2, where the local Don is walking around collecting his vig, it just needs to wet his beak a little bit. Trump kind of views himself in that way. I'm sure it's borderline unconstitutional, but effectively what Trump has done is he has sold export licenses to these companies in exchange for 15% of their revenue. Much of the tariffs regime is blatantly unconstitutional. Congress has the sole power to raise funds for the government, and to the extent that Trump has leaned on obscure Emergency Powers Act, laws, this is clearly nothing to do about that. This is just Trump's way of remaking society. Now, we do think tariffs play an important part in a much broader picture that very few people are talking about, and we painted the outlines of that picture in a piece called Crescendo, which we published a week ago today. Happy to get into that if you're interested, but we view tariffs as just another phase of World War III that began in the mid-teens when Putin started dumping treasuries and buying gold, and everything else that we see on the screen is a skirmish, a battle in that larger war. It's no surprise to us that Brazil and India are the big targets, and that there's a hot war going on with Russia, and that the U.S. is trying to reindustrialize as fast as it can because it views itself as losing that war against the BRICS countries. And so there is a broader agenda here that nobody talks about, but that's a bit of a controversial view, judging by at least the comments that we got when we published that piece last Monday.
Yeah. Well, shoot. First Amendment rights, freedom of speech. So let's dive into that. So
sure.
World War III. I mean, that's something that's scary to think of. Especially with all of the tension going on right now. So I've read like multiple reports, and I'm kind of careful with some of these headline reports, but to my understanding, and feel free to correct me, because I know you do a lot more due diligence on this and such, and you're writing on it. Apparently, Trump wants to make a deal. That there was an article out of the Jerusalem Times that mentioned that Trump said that it's possible for a land exchange or something of that nature. And then Europe is urging Trump to include Ukraine in that discussion. Zelensky does not want to give up any type of land or anything of that nature. Putin wants the land, from what I read. And so it sounds like there's a lot of this is a hardball negotiation. So I'm just kind of wondering, where does this even lead to?
Yeah. So last spring for our Pro Tier, we put out a presentation called Sleepwalking into the Abyss. And by then it was already clear, again, this will be controversial to those that only read Western propaganda outlets. But by then it was already clear that Russia had defeated NATO in the battlefield. And let's not kid ourselves. This is a war between NATO and Russia, fought by mostly Ukrainian soldiers with the oversight of Western generals and using Western weapons and financial support. And Russia has been fighting a traditionally Russian war strategy of grinding attrition. Wars of attrition are not measured by land, they're measured by casualties. The casualty figures are extremely controversial and subject to massive propaganda and manipulation, but by and large, you can tell who's winning and who's losing by who's demanding a ceasefire, and it's not Russia. And all the way back then, you could see that the Russia was going to win this war, had already won the war effectively, predominantly because of the failure of the Ukrainian counterattack in 2023, which was thoroughly beaten back by the Russians. And then Russia has a vastly larger economy, produces vastly more weapons than NATO. Its supply chains are right there. Our supply chains are entangled with China. And there's just no way that a much bigger country with a more sophisticated manufacturing sector than the West gives its credit for and an endless supply of cheap, abundant energy was going to lose that war. And as the months have gone on and territories are lost and casualties pile up and armies shrink on the Ukrainian side and grow on the Russian side, we're getting close to a point of collapse along the front lines, in the Donbass in particular. By the way, the data that we use to come to this conclusion is predominantly coming out of Ukraine itself, a daily mapping project called Deep State, which you can follow every day. They are tied to the Ukrainian military sort of intelligence complex, but at the same time, they're rather accurate, and at least you're getting, if it's sounding bad there, it must be bad in reality. And so what's happening now is we believe Trump knew when he came into office that the war was lost. He was convinced by the more sort of war hawk wing of the Washington, D.C. establishment to have one more go at effectively a bluff, threatening 100% secondary sanctions, which he could never impose. They would backfire in the U.S. immediately. Everybody knew it. And I think he's come to grips with the fact, because he's a businessman who's had some deals go bad, that he needs to cut his losses and move on. And so he went and set up this meeting with Putin. He sent Witkoff over to Moscow, much to the shock of the Ukrainians and the Europeans, who are in frankly, deep denial about what's going on. So Ukraine would rather fight to the last because they're like claiming that they won't even give up Crimea, which has been in Russian hands for over a decade now. And there's no military way that land will ever be retaken. Same with most of the 4 regions that the Russians now claim as their own and occupy the majority of. And so if Trump has his way, he would have cut a deal a long time ago. The great fear in Europe and Ukraine is that he is going to cut that deal. And then the Europeans and the Ukrainians will refuse that deal, and I believe Trump will walk away. Now, we should say we're recording this before the meeting in Alaska has happened, and this podcast will be published after that meeting has concluded, and so it's entirely possible that everything we say will be proven totally wrong. But on the Monday before the meeting, that's our view. Whether Trump is talked out of a productive meeting with Putin remains to be seen. If nothing comes of this and Trump does walk away, the war will be won militarily, and military victors get to set the terms. And the terms will be much harsher than what could have been had for the past year. But many in Europe who only read European propaganda and think that Europe is somehow still relevant or powerful or meaningful geopolitically will be totally angered by this. The great fear is that if Trump cuts a deal with Putin, even if it's rejected and then Russia goes on to a crushing military defeat, it's kind of the end of the European Union. They've bet the house on this project. Wars are hard to lose, which is one of the reasons why you should try really hard not to get into them.
Yeah, that's very, very grim end of the European Union. So with this, obviously when Trump came in, there was a lot of he threw out a lot of claims against the EU and many of the U.S. allies about the U.S. kind of being used in this process in terms of, we gave a lot of military support and such. And so I'm kind of wondering, what is this partnership? What does this allyship look like, now?
I think if Trump had his way, he would remove the U.S. from NATO and he would cut ties with Europe. He's always said that the European Union was formed to, quote, screw America. Look at the way he treated Ursula von der Leyen in Scotland. The European Union has ridden the U.S. defense shield for a very long time, has underinvested in its own militaries to take care of itself. And Trump is calling them on it. Now, he's limited politically in that regard, but all of the signals are that that's what Trump would want to do. He's far more interested in containing China long enough to rebuild the U.S. manufacturing base so that the U.S. can rebuild its military-industrial complex. I mean, I saw a report over the weekend where like 70 to 80% of all U.S. weapons have critical components that are made in China. Trump is directionally correct. The timing and the sequencing is where he's making mistakes, in our view. But a defeat of NATO by Russia will reverberate for decades geopolitically. The U.S. is very low on weapons. That is the fundamental axiom that feeds our mental model. And as analysts trying to objectively, measure a situation, when the U.S.'s stockpiles ran low, which is not controversial, Trump said it on Air Force One. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said it in front of Congress. The time it will take to replenish those inventories that have been destroyed on the battlefield in Ukraine will be many years. The technology was exposed as inadequate for modern warfare for much of those weapon systems. The Ukrainian army has far more battlefield experience than in modern warfare than the U.S. Army now does. Russia has grown stronger from this. They've taken all of their technological learnings and undoubtedly shared them with the Chinese and perhaps even the Iranians and the North Koreans. The head of NATO, Mark Rutte, says that Russia alone is outproducing all NATO countries by a factor of 4 in key weaponry. Now, that's before you add in China, by far the world's manufacturing superpower, North Korea, which spends 25% of its GDP on the military, and Iran, which, again, is wildly underestimated in the West. The people that are advocating for these forever wars, the Lindsey Grahams of the world, believe that the U.S. has an infinite supply of weapons and can win every war it gets into and has infinite capacity to project power around the world because America is America. Well, I don't know when the last time the U.S. won a significant war. Certainly not through winning the peace. Probably World War II. I think Grenada doesn't count. And so, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, this 12-day war between Israel and Iran, all of this has been wildly miscovered in the legacy media. And it's a shame because people don't have the real picture of what's going on. And if they did, I suppose they'd be quite angry.
The copper market, of course, is the biggest metal market on the planet, 2 to 300 billion globally of metal traded. Following majors around and picking up projects that they jettison can lead to great success in this business. Vizsla Copper, we're the team that brought you successes including ISO Energy and Vizsla Silver. If you want to learn more, you can find us at vizslacopper.com.
There's a few threads I want to pull on there. So what allies do we have left? Like, that's kind of like what I'm wondering, because you got like the BRICS nations coming together, Russia, China. I mean, China's providing 70% of the critical minerals for military defense and such. And so, and then Russia and China seem to be aligned in a lot of ways. And so I'm kind of wondering, like, what does this mean? Like, when we think of like the allies of the U.S., we think of like World War II. You had the allies, support each other, and they went out and won the war. I guess it depends on which part of history you read or whatever. But generally, you would think like, okay, yeah, we have these allies that have been our allies for a long time. But right now, I'm like, who is still our allies? Like, it seems like we're kind of going on a lone ranger type thing,
Well, one of the things we note with some interest is that the sanctions are generally working economically for Trump as it pertains to the subset of countries over which the U.S. has escalation dominance. So the EU, Britain, etc., and Japan, South Korea, and these countries happen to have U.S. military bases on them. Where they're not working are Russia, China, India, Brazil. And in fact, if anything, the 50% headline tariffs or sanctions on, or tariffs, I guess, who knows, they're the same word now, on India and Brazil seems to have driven the BRICS even closer together. We note with interest that it appears as though President Putin will be traveling to India, that Modi is going to be traveling to China, and then both Putin and Modi will travel to China together. Highly unusual. There's talk of, a solidarity meeting amongst the BRICS leaders as a show of unity. And ultimately, access to the U.S. market is just a small slice now of global trade. And to the extent that the U.S. needs these materials as much as those countries need to sell them to the U.S., the Trump just does not have escalation dominance with either Russia conventionally. Of course, there's always the taboo subject of nuclear war. And then with China economically, he just does not have escalation dominance. China could turn off much of the U.S. economy tomorrow. When Liberation Day happened and Trump slapped those tariffs on China shut off access to rare earths, and most of the U.S. automotive manufacturing industry would have had to shut down within weeks. It stuns us because we've been writing about this for a very long time, as you know. It's very clear to anybody with industrial experience that China had manipulated its way into monopolistic positions in critical materials. We wrote a piece 2 years ago called Geopolitical Warfare, where we correctly pointed out that China was debasing its environment in order to gain geopolitical leverage in the economic wars that were already going on. And the thing that shocked us is that the Trump administration, knowing that they had this leverage, were shocked to find out that they were willing to use it. Of course they were willing to use it. Why else would you pay so much to get it if you're not going to deploy it? And so China called Trump's bluff. Putin, Russia, India, China, and Brazil called the tariffs bluff. And Trump had no choice but to blink. And we'll see. He's in a tough spot politically because in D.C., there are still these people who think that the U.S. is, the omnipowerful, unipolar superpower, and that Russia is a gas station, masquerading as a country. That it couldn't be a more dangerous and arrogant thing to say about a country as powerful and sophisticated as Russia, by the way. And that doesn't make me a Russophile or a Putin puppet. It just makes me an analyst who can recognize reality. Like they are vastly outproducing all of NATO. And Lindsey Graham goes on TV and thinks that sanctions are going to hurt them. It's insane. Sanctions never work. They were a terrible idea under the Biden administration. We wrote about it often, predicted the result correctly. they're an even worse idea under Trump because at least he has the history to read to see that they don't work. I don't get it. But alas, here we are. We'll see what comes of the meeting on Friday.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So looking at like further out, I mean, it sounds like defense spending across the globe, which I've seen some statistics that they're going to continue to increase significantly. And then now you have this dynamic with China controlling about a lot of the rare earths and the materials that are needed for defense weapons. And so to even onshore all of that, that's going to cost a lot of money as well. And so, I mean, it just seems like that's going to be the direction that the world is headed.
Yeah, so let's talk about the positive aspects of this. Trump has gone around the world, the Middle East most notably, and but in other tariff negotiations as well, and garnered significant investment commitments from sovereign wealth funds and so on in the United States. And if only a fraction of those materialize, it's going to lead to a significant investment boom in the U.S., especially for those industries that can be repurposed to close the gaping holes in U.S.'s military supply chains. And we're seeing this now with the deal with MP Materials. We suspect there'll be dozens of other deals just like that. So there is going to be, the economic side of Trump's revitalization plan offers amazing opportunities for investors. That is the positive side of the geopolitical friction that you and I have been describing. And that is real. It's coming. We see it in the private markets already. If you're an entrepreneur who can contribute to the closing of geopolitical weakness for the U.S. military, you're going to make a lot of money. Trying to guess what the DoD will invest in, some obvious signs, but we don't pick stocks. But certainly in the private markets, we're seeing extreme interest in getting participation in companies that can help in that regard, and there's plenty of them. America is a fantastic country. It's blessed with enormous resources. It lost its way with the financialization of everything. The two things that market forces don't do a good job of pricing are environmental degradation and national security. And those two converge to give China a huge upper hand. But it does not mean that the U.S. cannot catch up and that a lot of money won't be made by a lot of investors between here and there.
Mm-hmm. And that's operating with the assumption that we're going to have like some, well, I wouldn't say years of peace, but some time.
Right.
We got time bought, right?
That's what Trump wants. That's why he wants to just cut his losses in Ukraine and have some stability, because the U.S. is not ready to stare down China. One of the big concerns is that China might sense this weakness and make a move on Taiwan prematurely. Time will tell. But for sure, there's going to be a lot of money sloshing around, both public money from the DoD directly and through allies who receive favorable tariff treatment in return, will be investing in the U.S. Our friend JJ at Market Vibes, Sir JJ Alyosha, whatever name you wish to give him, he wrote out a great piece called Checkmate, a very bullish assessment of Trump's tariff forward investment strategy. When Trump first came down the escalator in 2015 and said, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico is going to pay for it, everybody laughed. Some people got outraged, of course, especially the government of Mexico. But essentially what Trump is doing is, I'm going to rebuild our military industrial complex and all these other countries are going to pay for it. They're going to be allowed to invest alongside the reconstruction of American supply chains. So Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Japan, European Union, Korea, South Korea, all the money that flows from these promises and carve-outs that Trump is effectively selling will flow into the U.S. markets one way or the other. So our JJ concluded that this is wildly bullish for bonds and bearish for interest rates, but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, that's bullish for bonds. Yeah, that's I couldn't even fathom that.
Well,
So
it's a contrarian call worth reading,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I'm totally bearish bonds, but I love to hear a different perspective. But okay, so that sounds like an opportunity for investors. So how does the Israel, how does this whole Middle East situation play into this? Do you have any perspective there?
Sure. So when we saw last October in the first sort of skirmish with Iran, we saw on Twitter, and the Washington Post later admitted, that Iranian missiles pierced Israeli air defense systems with surprising ease. And that was a shocking revelation to most. And we think laterally around here, and we developed some axioms. The key to lateral thinking is having no emotional attachment to whether your axioms are true. And our belief was that Israel could not go to war with Iran, because if Iran does have, hypersonic or, ballistic missiles that can pierce Israel's, vaunted air defense system with ease, and those missiles have precision guidance abilities, and it's pretty clear that they did. The fact that Israel gets, all of its power from a handful of power plants and all of its water from a handful of desalination plants, all of its natural gas from 2 fields, a dozen targets could make Israel unlivable. And so while Iran might not have had the bomb, we hypothesized last October that there was effectively mutually assured destruction. People were angry at that. It always amazes me how people read, authentically held beliefs politely expressed and with homework shown and get angry, but that's a topic for another day. So anyway, war didn't happen last year, and then suddenly it happened this year, and we were shocked. And the reason why we were shocked is because we had been following the Ukraine war so thoroughly, and we knew that the U.S. was chronically short on air defense missiles, and that Israel gets 80% of its air defense missiles from the U.S. And so when that first decapitation strike happened, we were surprised. We were clearly wrong. We wrote a piece admitting as much, that war did happen, and we predicted that it wouldn't. And it's important to point out when you've made mistakes and try to understand why. And the axiom that we got wrong was Israeli leaders were aware of this critical weakness and would act accordingly. We got that wrong. They were probably aware of it, but figured they could succeed in a decapitation strike. So when that decapitation strike failed, because the government of Iran got back on its feet, we said to ourselves, if missiles are still landing in Israel, within 3 to 4 days, this war is lost, and will have to come to an end very quickly. And sure enough, on the 3rd or 4th day, Israel implemented a very thorough crackdown and censorship on information coming out of Israel. But information was still coming out of Israel and could be found through open source intelligence channels. Their largest refinery, for example, was hit and damaged severely by a ballistic missile. There's video of that on the internet. At least there was before the censors took it down. And so that war had to end quickly, and Trump made it end with some theater, but Trump made it end. It was Israel who needed that ceasefire much more than Iran. Of course, Israel could have always went for the nuclear option, but nobody wins in that scenario. Again, another set of views that are controversial for people to hear if all they're doing is consuming Western propaganda. But if you're an independent thinker and you can see what's going on, and you know that the U.S. is chronically short air defense missiles, and that Iran has thousands of ballistic missiles with targeting capabilities, that Israel could not win a war of attrition against Iran. Iran's got 20 times the population. And so when that war ended, when Trump announced that Saturday that he had destroyed and buried the nuclear facilities, that was his face-saving way out of the war. The oil markets sniffed this out. We told a friend of ours who's in the oil business that they needed to fade the oil open on that Sunday, and that was a correct call, because the markets knew that this war was over, and oil dropped precipitously because of it. And so if you can stay anchored to axioms that you believe are true, or at least are working to explain the news headlines, then you can cut your way through the propaganda. Last thing I'll say, we get the most anger from people living in Britain, believe it or not. That's because British propaganda is just outrageous. It is so thick of lies, like blatant, ridiculous, insane lies, day after day after day after day, that the average British person is living in a totally different universe than reality. And it's amazing to us to observe. Longtime subscribers, 5-star ratings, read every piece, angrily unsubscribe because we correctly predicted the outcome of the 12-day war. It's pretty amazing. I've noted it now twice on this podcast, Darrell, because it is an important signal for where society is heading, especially as Britain tries to take over the internet, and the EU censorship regime comes rolling through. Like, if you're an independent thinker, it's going to get a lot harder to recognize when you're being lied to and to try to find the truth.
Yeah, that's a scary world. That's an Orwellian. I would say that. So I do want to talk a little bit about what role does gold play in all of this. So we know that central banks have been buying, still buying, and that gold has been a way for Russia to thrive. I mean, they're pretty much thriving right now, and they haven't. I think they dumped all the treasuries are gone or whatnot, the U.S. treasuries. And so, what role does gold play in all of this, especially even for like the average person? Because this is a lot of risk, especially if there's war and things of that nature. And so, what role does gold play in this?
Well, gold is playing a central role. And in the piece Crescendo, we show the plot of the Russian gold reserves and the Russian treasury reserves through the mid-teens. And as you correctly said, Russia dumped all its treasuries and bought a bunch of gold. And gold is a neutral reserve asset. It used to be that treasuries, U.S. debt, European debt, Western debt in general, were considered neutral reserve assets. You could park, imbalances that accumulate because of international trade in those debt instruments and feel confident that, they were money good, they were neutral. Well, when you politicize the global neutral reserve asset, i.e. by seizing Russia's reserves, you tell the world that the treasuries are no longer neutral. And if you're a country that has ever been in the U.S. crosshairs, or might someday be in the U.S. crosshairs, you can't really trust that your money is money good anymore, and you need something that is neutral, genuinely neutral. And gold serves that role. And we believe this is why gold has been on a straight line up. And then more speculatively, a revaluation of U.S. gold reserves could help the Treasury refinance this wave of short-term bills that are coming due. And that is always sort of out there as a risk to the upside. But gold is a key part of our savings portfolio. We don't view it as an investment. We don't speculate in it. We try to keep gold at a certain proportion of our total savings amount. And so if it appreciates too much, we might trim it a bit and buy some land. Or if it sinks, we might sell a Rolex or two and buy some gold, But that's more just sort of portfolio management, up to every individual investor. But long term, we view gold as a way to preserve purchasing power. And so there is no money today. The US dollar is not money. It is currency and it is a medium of exchange. But since it does not preserve purchasing power, it is not money. Gold is not money because even though it preserves purchasing power, it is not a medium of exchange. Same with Bitcoin. There is no money today. So you need to use different instruments for different purposes. We earn money in fiat. We save by buying real assets, and we invest privately where we can impact the outcome. That's always been our strategy. And so gold is just a great means to save money. 20 gold eagles today would buy you a very nicely appointed mid-size SUV. And 20 gold eagles in 10 years will buy you a very nicely appointed mid-size SUV. And 20 gold eagles 10 years ago buy you a very nicely appointed mid-size SUV. That is the purpose of gold. The price of gold is actually the price of the dollar. And the number of dollars it takes to buy an ounce of gold says more about the US dollar than it does about gold.
Yeah, that's true. So a couple things. So gold is just like how you mentioned, safe haven, and part of safe haven is sovereignty for individuals, to pretty much protect themselves from the devaluation of the currency and whatever fiat currency it is. Gold has always been a protection against that. So recently, the Genius Act was passed, and I talked with a few people about this and the issuance of or the deregulation of or clarity of regulation on stable coins and such. And many folks believe it's just another CBDC and just packaged in another form, and that the privacy and freedom of individuals could be at risk with this act. And just wanted to see if you had any perspective on this.
We're not so much concerned about that. The real purpose of all of this is to create demand for short-term treasuries, and so there's a purposeful intent to create a cryptomania by key members of this administration, because the main on-ramp into the crypto universe is you exchange US dollars for stable coins, and then the operators of those stable coins buy short-term US treasuries now by law, and they represent a persistent bid for short-term US paper. It's no more complicated than that. And so if the total stablecoin market cap, if you could call it that, grows to $2 trillion or $3 trillion, and the operators of those stable coins get to clip the coupons, they're the ones collecting the coupons, they're happy to invest in short-term treasuries, and that represents a substantial bid for U.S. short-term debt. And I think this is precisely what this is all about. And clever in a way, but also sort of testimony to the fiscal situation the U.S. has put itself in, that it needs to resort to such tools, effectively tricking average people to enter a casino in order to create a bid for short-term treasuries.
Yeah, it seems like a desperation move, for sure, especially, considering that, the spending and the amount of investment we need to do, considering how that needs to be financed.
Yeah, I mean, we wrote a piece called "The U.S. is Not Broke" again, which sort of landed controversially with some, but the U.S. has many handles to pull. This is one of them. Revaluing gold is another. It owns hundreds of millions of acres of pristine land that could be very valuable. The balance sheet of the U.S. is not complete. And it could also get spending under control. I mean, I'm very disappointed with the lackluster performance of Doge. Alas, government is incredibly challenging to tame. We believe that simple things, like if every current Social Security recipient had to reapply using biometrics to make sure that they're alive and they're real, you would probably cut a huge amount of waste and fraud out of the system. Same thing with Medicare, filled with fraud. The U.S. defense industry filled with fraud and cronyism and bribery and blackmail and every dirty trick that happens, in late-stage empire type stuff. The U.S. spends vastly more than the Russians spend on their military, and yet Russia's wildly outproducing them with largely homegrown supply chains, impervious to sanctions at this point. And so, there's scandals here, to be sure. But again, the U.S. has got many, many resources. It's the world's largest energy producer by a wide margin. It has amazing infrastructure inherited from generations that have since passed. A great foundation for a rebirth, which, to Trump's credit, he is at least trying to do.
Yeah. I mean, I can appreciate that. I mean, especially he's bringing a lot of things up to the forefront that has not been discussed at this scale politically in a while.
I saw a great tweet. Again, I wish I could remember or jot down who says these things, but somebody put a tweet out to the effect that in 300 years, Trump will be some mythical figure that people won't believe ever existed. He's so out of the norm across every dimension, even his use of social media to make major political decisions and so on. It's really quite something to behold. Frustrating to try to chronicle in real time, in some ways, but also fascinating because there's no shortage of things to write about for sure.
Just really quick before we leave, you did mention the revaluation of gold. I saw that there was a Fed article on the Fed or something like that came out, and I read it briefly. Is that something that's really being considered, or is that just?
Yeah, I think so.
How did that even get out on the Fed site? I was wondering.
I mean, gold is currently held on the U.S. balance sheet at $40 and change. Right. It's not mark to market. And so a revaluation of the U.S.'s gold through some arcane financial engineering, allegedly, would free up substantial tools for the Treasury. And so you could imagine a world where the U.S. just decides one day that its gold is worth $10,000. Forget what the market says. This is how the U.S. has decided it's going to value its gold. You remember all this talk about printing a $1 trillion palladium coin?
Yeah.
There's no different than that. The U.S. government can do what it wants. It's effectively a debasement of the U.S. dollar. $10,000 gold is a debasement of the U.S. dollar. Who's hurt by that? Who knows? But that's there. It's a tool. All the tools will be pulled before the Great Reset. And if they have to let the price of gold go up and some banks who are short it get hurt, you can always bail out the banks, and off we go.
Yeah, I kind of wonder what does that do for inflation? I know that when they revalued it, when they confiscated and revalued in the 30s, they devalued the dollar in that transaction or in that change in the rules. But yeah, I kind of wonder what happens there.
Yeah, it's such an event is kind of like a singularity in physics. The laws of economics break down, and you have to wait and see what comes out of the other side. But I think it's definitely a possibility. Look, something has to happen, right? The U.S. fiscal situation, while we still think the U.S. is not broke, its fiscal situation is chronically in chronic health, like very unhealthy. Something dramatic needs to be done. Trump and Bessent believe they can grow their way out of it, maybe, with the wave of foreign money coming in, temporary yield curve control so that they can sort of bridge to the utopian prosperity of MAGA. That seems to be the plan. Whether it can work ahead of the midterms remains to be seen. But that is the plan. If you listen to what they say, that is the plan. We are using tariffs to browbeat our friends, mostly, to bring money into the U.S., to rebuild American supply chains. And this will catalyze a boom in growth and jobs for Americans. Fraud and waste in government will be trimmed. And if the Fed, which is why Trump is so angry at Jerome Powell, he wants the Fed to basically embark on temporary yield curve control as a bridge so that refinancing the wave of debt that the U.S. now has doesn't, strangle the baby in the crib. And the belief is that, once the U.S. is booming again, you could take that yield curve control off. Some would argue that once you embark on such an experiment, it's pretty difficult to stop it. But that's the strategy. That's the pieces as they lay on the board. And as objective analysts, I think it's important to try to play them as they lie.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely seems like they're pulling for all types of strings and trying to figure something out. They're trying to make something work.
Trump is always the showman.
Yes, for sure. Well, with that being said, Doomberg, where can people find more about your work and your writings and your pieces? Sure.
Doomberg.com is a great starting point. We have about 90 articles a year, every 4 days, roughly. And then for our pro tier, which in addition to those articles get a pretty in-depth monthly presentation, typically 45 minutes to an hour long, that we work pretty hard on putting together. That the pro tier is there as well. This month's presentation is going to be on lateral thinking. We did a presentation on gold recently, which was well received. All of our stuff is there. Our podcasts are there under the Doomcast tab. Darrell, congrats again. Great to see you doing such good work for VRIC, and always a pleasure talking to you either here or on your own show, which I know is going great as well. So appreciated the opportunity, and talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Doom. All right, take care. And everyone, be sure to click this subscribe button to support the channel. You all have a good day.